Good evening, everyone, here in the Netherlands and wherever in Europe or other places where it's nightfall, 8 p.m. Dutch time, but it's 11 a.m. Pacific time, where Laila is at, Laila Lalami. Welcome to BorderKitchen. It's such a privilege and a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
How are you, first of all?
I'm enjoying a beautiful day that we're finally having some clean air. We had wildfire smoke for a while, so it's a beautiful day.
Oh, that's good because you're in LA.
Yeah.
And you've had heavy,
Smoke.
basically. So it's clearing up now. Okay, that's good to know. Okay, well, thanks again for being with us. And I saw you tweeting a couple of times already, but come on out and join us. We're going to talk about your fabulous book, I may say, The Moor's Account, which now has been translated into Dutch. And in Dutch, it's called La Florida. And Laila, I think you you don't have the book yourself yet, right? Or have you?
Not yet. So I put the U.S. I put the U.S. paperback here just as a visual aid.
Beautiful, really nice. It's everything physically you hope for a book, but it's also beautifully translated, I have to say, which obviously you can't check, but the translation is done by Lucy van Rooyen and Inger Limburg. So shout out to your two translators, because I think they did a fabulous job. And let's talk about your book. But before I do that, I just want to let people know Laila Lalami is a Moroccan-American novelist, essayist, and professor. She's professor of creative writing at the University of California, Riverside. She studied in Morocco, the UK, and in the United States. She completed a PhD in linguistics at the University of Southern California and began writing in '96, and fiction and nonfiction both, right? But you've started writing in English then, but how many languages do you actually speak?
I speak 4. I speak Arabic, French, English, and Spanish. Yeah.
You're almost un-American, right? So you've been writing literary criticism, cultural commentary, and opinion pieces in the Boston Globe, Boston Review, the LA Times, the Nation, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Daily Beast, and elsewhere. So you've been writing all over. But you started your first book in 2005, a collection of short stories, Hope and Other Dangerous Pursuits, followed by Secret Sun in 2009, and The Moor's Account is your third book. But you've been quite productive. You've already have a 4th and 5th book. So you're kind of in a double book promotion tour, as it were, while sitting at home. It's
yes. That's right.
But it's a shame we can't actually invite you over to the Netherlands, but I hope we can make good on that another time in sort of post-COVID era, right? So the Moor's Account in Dutch, La Florida, it won the American Book Award, the Arab American Book Award, the Hurston Wright Legacy Award, and was a finalist for the 2015 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. So really a lot of accolades for your book, but how did you come across it? What triggered you to actually write this book? And where did you pick up the story? Because it is a true story in a way.
Yeah, it is based on a true story. I love actually talking about how the book came about. It always puts a smile on my face because it's such a wonderful story of complete happenstance. Back in the fall of 2009, I was assigned a book to review by The Nation magazine. The Nation magazine is a very old literary and cultural magazine here in the US. And as I was doing research for that book to write my book review, I came across a book called We Are All Moors, which is by a Moroccan scholar named Anwar Majid. And it talks about how the image of the immigrant, the modern image of the immigrant that exists right now in the US and Europe, derives in many ways from the perceptions of the Moors as being foreigners, people whose languages, whose cultures, whose traditions are distinct from those of Europe. And halfway through the book, Anwar very casually mentioned this man that the Spaniards called Estevanico, who was supposed to be a Moroccan slave, an enslaved man who had come on a Spanish expedition called the Narvaez expedition to Florida and became one of the first outsiders to cross North America. And when I came across that mention, I was completely taken aback because as you mentioned, I was born and raised in Morocco, so I went to school there, and I don't remember ever being taught about this man in history class. And I had also, when I was in college, I majored in English, and I had studied US history for a bit, and I had never also come across him there either. So I was really intrigued, and so I ended up, finishing my review and turning it in, and then I decided to go look up this expedition and find out more about it. And that is how I came across this book, which is called Chronicle of the Narvaez Expedition, which is a book in the Penguin Classic series by Cabeza de Vaca. This is a book that the minute I read it, I knew I had to do something with it because Cabeza de Vaca is, of course, famous. He was a famous Spanish explorer. And in this book, he recounts how in 1528, the Narvaez expedition landed in Florida with the goal of claiming it for the Spanish crown. And it was an expedition that included 600 men, women, and children, horses, pigs, chickens, everything you can imagine. And within a year, all of that might is essentially disappears, and there's only a handful of survivors, including Cabeza de Vaca and this enslaved man named Estevanico, and they start to wander across North America for the better part of a decade. And then they are found years later, and they are brought to Mexico City, and they're asked to provide testimony about what happened. And all of the Spanish gentlemen are essentially deposed in a very official manner in Mexico City. But the slave or the enslaved man, because of his status, is not asked to provide testimony. And so when I got to the end of Cabeza de Vaca's book, on the very last page, he gives an account of each of the survivors and gives us a bit of biography about each of them. And about Estevanico, all he says is that he was an Arabic-speaking Black man, a native of Moor, which is a small town on the Atlantic coast of Morocco, and an Arabic-speaking Black man, a native of Moor. And that was it. There's no other biographical details. So I was really struck by that. I was struck by the absence of this enslaved man from the historical record. And I was also struck by the fact that this book, which is considered the very first account we have of Spanish exploration in North America, does not include any voices of any women. It's as if they did not exist. And also has only one indigenous man that is given a name. All others are just unnamed, unheard, and all of that. And there are reasons for this, right? But I was because this book comes out in 1542. It's the middle of the Spanish Inquisition, and Cabeza de Vaca is a married nobleman who, obviously is not going to mention any relationships with indigenous women lest it attract the inquisitor. And then there's also, there's a kind of agenda that he has in place himself. And so when I got to the end of the book, it was like a light bulb moment for me, because immediately I thought, what a fantastic story of transformation, where you have somebody who lands, who's a conqueror, thinking they have all this technological superiority, and in short order, within a year, they are struggling to survive because of things like obviously indigenous resistance, but also an epidemic and just errors in navigation. So there's a number of factors. So it's a story of transformation where the conquerors become conquered, and it's a story of erasure. And immediately I thought, what a fantastic opportunity in fiction, because fiction, unlike real life, can be written from any perspective. In real life, the conquerors get to decide what history we are taught. But in fiction, you know, you could decide to give, to basically write any story from any perspective you choose. And so I thought it would be really interesting and challenging to write this story from the perspective of this enslaved man in the first person. And to try and see how a man like that might tell the same story using the exact same facts, but how would it be told if it was told from his perspective? And that was how I came about that idea. It was November of 2009. And so I spent the next 5 years researching the book and writing it, going through many drafts, and it came out here in the US in 2014. And then in the Netherlands this year. So it's been a long journey.
Right, another 5 years or so.
Yeah.
But happy that it landed here.
Yes, yes, I'm delighted. Yes.
Yeah, and so are we. Yeah, and it was such an almost, this is weird to say, but an easy read because of your, the eloquence of your pen.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a lot of things that prop up, of course, that are hard to swallow, maybe even. And
Yes.
before we go there,
Yes.
I was struck by what you said about the what I would translate as the freedom that you have as a fiction writer.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm a cultural historian myself. I do research on the history of slavery, and sort of we're confined, if you will, to certain rules and regulations.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas you can step out of those tight bonds and sort of take it away. And so, although it's a fictionalized travelogue, as you say, from a Black Moroccan man, a Moor, in a way, it felt to me while I was reading it that it was quite real, in the sense that, all the daily things that happen, the interactions with the Native Americans, made it quite real in a way. But how was it for you to do that process of writing? Was it pleasurable? Was it daunting? Was it excruciating? What was it like?
It was all of those things at once. The first feeling that I had when I decided to write this book, I mentioned it was like a light bulb moment because the idea was so fantastic. And then, of course, I had to face the execution. And that is when fear settled in, because what do I know about the 16th century in North America? And so it was really frightening. And I almost gave up on the project when I realized what it would involve and the amount of research and the difficulty of it. But it was just too good to pass up. And I remember, in fact, when I thought about it, that I actually went online and I looked to see if somebody else had written this, because it's such a great, like, why hasn't anybody else done that? And so I decided to go ahead and do it. So I was fortunate in the sense that this particular expedition has attracted the interest of a number of historians and anthropologists, just because it was, as I mentioned, the first narrative we have of Spanish exploration of North America, and therefore it includes a lot of ethnographic details. So, for example, he describes, Cabeza de Vaca describes some of the tribes that they lived in, that they lived with, and some of their habits and how they looked and all of that. And so for that reason, attracted the interest of anthropologists. And there were a number of people who had actually drawn a fairly detailed itinerary based on what Cabeza de Vaca had written. So all of this research was waiting for me to just read up and like use as kind of a basis of like, okay, this is where we are, and this is where they are roughly this year, this month, for the better part of the decade. But then also, because in writing history, we often use our limited perspectives, that also meant that the sources really emphasized what the Spanish survivors had experienced. And I, as a writer and as a reader, had a very different perspective on this. As a reader, I remember very clearly when I was a little girl, reading books as a child and seeing how Africans are written about by Europeans. And I remember that feeling of like really enjoying a story and then suddenly feeling thrown out of it because you come across an image or a piece of dialogue or a depiction that is so utterly divorced from your reality. And so I knew that when this research that I was reading was very much from the perspective of people who had conquered this territory. So I was alert to that as I was reading the research. The other thing I want to say about it is that while this Cabeza de Vaca, it was the primary source, he was by no means the only source of research for me. Obviously, I mentioned the anthropologist, but also there's a vast amount of material that is from that era. So for example, if you look at the letters that Christopher Columbus wrote in 1492, after he landed in Cuba, he wrote to tell the king and queen that he had landed and this is what he had seen. And it is a document of such incredible hubris, because he basically says that, oh yeah, we could take all of these Indians and make them into slaves with just a handful of men. And like reading this in the voice of the person who landed was incredibly instructive for me, because it tells me that this is sort of a prevailing point of view of the people who are landing. And then there are other documents, like there's the phenomenal book that I always recommend called The Conquest of New Spain by Bernal Diaz, who was a contemporary of Hernan Cortez. And so he was there in 1520 when the Spaniards landed in Mexico. And this book, oh my God, it is full of incredible descriptions of brutality and torture and of the things that they did, and that they did not even, like Bernal Diaz, it doesn't occur to him to think that this is shameful or that there's anything wrong with it, because at the time, from a religious perspective, they did not even have settled the idea that Native Americans had souls. So they were looking at these people really in a way as subhuman and writing about them that way. So in that context, when you have all of that historical material, to then switch and say, okay, now I'm looking at the same material, but I'm looking at it from the perspective of a 16th century Moroccan man. And the challenge is not to look at it from the perspective of a 21st century Moroccan woman living in Los Angeles, right? So then to really try and stay true to that voice, and to have this character feel somewhat caught between these prevailing ideas of what the conquerors have brought, but also he himself is an enslaved man and knows what it's like to be on the receiving end of these ideas. So it is a sort of a nuanced position. And in the beginning of the book, using the same facts and trying to incorporate them in the story, I try to let him have somewhat superficial idea about Native Americans until halfway through the book, when he gets to spend more time with them, and then his ideas become a little bit more complex. So in weaving this research into the narrative, the main thing was to stick with whatever facts Cabeza de Vaca gives us, but enriching them with the knowledge of other sources, and then creating a fictional scene and having the characters in them. So it was a process that was at once emotional, but also intellectual. It was fun, but it was scary. It was exhilarating, and it was frightening. It was a lot of emotions at once. Yeah.
Right. Well, we're happy you persevered. But indeed, you are talking about the conquistadores. So the white men from Southern Europe that go on a conquest. They've been to the South, they've been to the East, and they're going to the West as well. And so talk a little bit about the violence in the book, because, well, I mean, we've seen a couple of books coming out lately, also about colonial history, fictionalized slavery. Colson Whitehead, of course, his book was very successful, although, again, a lot of violence takes place in particular ways. And so for some of us, it's probably, oh my God, that's so violent. And others will think, among myself, I guess, like, well, you know, it's there, but there's a lot of other stuff there as well. So talk a little bit about that, because I mean, it's so important to talk about the violence, but how do you do that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really good question. In the book, when I sat down to write it, I realized that for me, I almost had to understate the violence in order for the violence to be
Present.
to be present in the fictional narrative, so that it is distinguishable from history. If you read Bernal Diaz, which is this like long 400-page book about how they landed in Mexico, it's there are a lot of really tedious moments because they're just going from town to town, and then all of a sudden he tells you very casually that they murdered this man and ended up cutting pieces of his body because they needed fat to use as balm on some of their wait, what? And it's just one of those, the violence is very casual. So in the book, I decided to sort of restrict the violence in a way and to stage it in crucial moments. There are only 2 or 3 scenes. I don't want to scare readers. There are only 2 or 3 scenes that involve torture and brutality. And I get so many questions about that because, in fact, the reality was far more brutal than what I've actually put in the book. But I've gotten questions and sometimes even challenges by readers saying, well, how do you know that they did this to this indigenous person? And I always ask, well, how do you think that we know from Cabeza de Vaca's story that they went from this part of Florida to this other part? And he tells us that they captured a group of indigenous men and they took them to the next village. And I'm saying, did they ask them and said, please and thank you, and were taken? Or do you think that there was coercion involved? And so in the book, I try to really let it be just 2 or 3 scenes and stage them in a way that leave an impact on the reader and then move on. So, but there are other books that have chosen a different route. Like you mentioned, there's, Colson Whitehead, and I was also thinking about Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy, which is set in the U.S. long after the exploration. It's one of the most brutal books you will read, and I am sure and in fact it is based on a true story as well. So in terms of brutality, I just look at the world around us right now, which is brutality is a part of human experience. As I speak right now in the United States, there are reports of forced hysterectomies on immigrant women that are held in an ICE facility, and this is Immigration and Customs facility in Georgia. We have a border wall across the entire southern border. The United States is now considering adding a floating border wall on the Rio Grande to prevent immigrants. I mean, you have Guantanamo Bay, you have the Iraq War. We live in an incredibly brutal world, and it is impossible to write about a story about cross-cultural contact and eventual domination without having brutality portrayed in it. That is a part of human experience, and it would not have made sense not to include it, but I think I wanted it to serve a purpose in the narrative, and that is why I chose to have only 2 or 3 scenes, rather than become to use the term torture porn, where it's just like constantly going from one torture scene to another, which can have the opposite effect of making indigenous people seem like objects rather than agents of their destiny. And one of the things that actually we see in the Narvaez expedition is that this idea that that exploration was the province of Spanish white men who came to the Americas and conquered it is actually a very simplistic idea, and it needs to be much more complicated than that. Yeah. There were people who were not white who were part of these expeditions, including the hero of my book, but there were also indentured servants, there were women, there were people who spoke different languages. These were cross-cultural, cross-linguistic expeditions, and they served the Spanish crown, of course, but it was a bit more complicated than that, and brutality absolutely played a part in it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Can I maybe invite you to read a little bit from your book, if you will?
Sure.
Great.
So we said, I think just about a page, right?
Really up to you. That's good.
Well, since we were talking about about reality, let me read from this scene. This takes place in the first chapter, and this is when the would-be conquerors have arrived. This scene takes place when they've arrived on the beach in Florida, and they have found a village that has been empty of its people. The indigenous people have seen them arrive, and so they fled, and the village is empty. And this is in the voice of Estebanico. My fears were confirmed early the next morning when we heard a commotion behind the village storehouse. Senor Dorantes had wanted me to give him a haircut, and I had just begun to trim the edges of his thick, wheat-colored hair. His beard had grown too, but he had not asked me to shave it. Perhaps he felt he did not need to worry about matters of grooming now that he had reached the edge of the empire. Or he grew his beard because he could, and the Indians, it was rumored, could not. I confess I did not ask him why. I was relieved to have fewer chores. But when we heard the cries of soldiers, Senor Dorantes shot to his feet with the white linen cloth still tight around his neck and ran across the square to see what had happened. I followed him, with the civilian scissors still in my hand. The soldiers, it turned out, had found some Indians hiding in the bushes and had captured 4 of them. All 4 were men. All 4 were naked. I had seen Indians before on the islands of Cuba and La Española, where the Armada had stopped to purchase more supplies, but never at such close range. I was unused to seeing men walk about in their natural state, unashamed of their bodies, so my first impulse was to stare. They were tall and broad-shouldered, with skin the color of earth when it has rained. Their hair was glossy and long, and on their right arms and left legs they had tattoos in shapes I did not recognize. One of them had a lazy eye, just like my Uncle Omar, and he blinked in order to focus his gaze on his captors. Another was surveying the village, taking stock of all that had changed since our arrival. A large cross had been set up by the temple. The governor's standard hung from a pole in the square, and along the perimeter, horses were tethered to newly built posts. The stories I had heard about the Indians had me expecting something incredible, fire-breathing jinns, perhaps, but these men looked harmless to me, especially next to the Castilian soldiers. Still, they were tied up and brought to Senor Narvaez. From his pocket, the governor retrieved the pebble of gold I had found. Holding it up in his palm, he asked them about it. Where did you find this gold? The captives looked at him levelly, and 2 of them said something in their mother tongue. I could not detect a pattern yet to the stream of sounds that emerged from their lips. Where did one word end and another one begin? My upbringing in a trading town like Azamor had instilled in me a love of language, and if I may be forgiven for this moment of immodesty, a certain ease with it. So I was curious about the Indian tongue, even though it had none of the clues that had been helpful to me when I learned new idioms. Familiar sounds, a few words in common, a similar intonation. But to my surprise, the governor nodded slowly, as if he understood the Indians perfectly and even agreed with them. Still, he repeated his question. Where did you find this gold? Behind him, the soldiers watched and waited. Up in the trees, birds were singing, determined in their trills despite the oppressive heat. The soothing sound of waves came from the beach nearby, and I could smell smoke in the air. Someone had already started a fire for the almuerzo. Again, the Indians answered the governor in the same way as before. At least, I assumed they were answering. It was just as likely that they were asking the governor a question of their own, or challenging him to a fight, or threatening him with death if he did not release them. The governor listened politely to their answers, and then he turned to his page. Lock them up in the storehouse, he said, and bring me a whip. Now we'll stop there. So it is more hinted, but yeah.
The governor is sort of faking that he actually gets all the stuff that they're talking about. It says actually Estebaniko who actually learns all these languages later.
Yeah.
There's a lot of in your book. There's a lot of instances of interaction on a very intimate level, even with Native Americans. And I was struck by that because sort of almost a century later, the Dutch more north with New Netherlands and New Amsterdam also have these encounters with Native Americans that are in the beginning actually quite friendly also. Relationships or helping each other out. Those types of exchanges happen too.
Correct. That's right. Absolutely.
And I really appreciated that about your book. Is that something that also, well, let's say, where did you pick that up? That notion?
Well, because it was, for me, when I started researching this book, it was really a deepening of my education about the conquest of America, where I had been taught that it was this sort of simplistic story of, like, you know, Spaniards and Portuguese arrive on their ships, they conquer the new territories, they subjugate these tribes. And while that is kind of true in the sort of like larger arc, the story is a lot more complex, particularly if you look at, for example, the conquest of Mexico and how much that depended on a number of factors, not just Hernan Cortés, who, by the way, this Narvaez person that the expedition that I write about is named after Narvaez. Narvaez was supposed to be the man who would have had Cortés's role if Cortés had not just decided to take his life into his own and just go and conquer Mexico without waiting for the proper paperwork, without waiting for the proper authorization from the king. That was supposed to be something that Narvaez would have done. So in looking at Mexico, it was basically a combination of factors. It was the fact that Cortés, as a leader, was able to take advantage of the fact that Mexico is a very large empire, and within it, there were tribes that were sometimes working together and sometimes they were at war with each other. And certainly with respect to the emperor, some tribes were rebelling against him, and Cortés arrives and he's able to take advantage of that. There's the fact that he benefited from the work of La Malinche. Without her and without her efforts at translating and helping him, he would not have been able to conquer. There's the fact that he had a bit of technological advantage with the horses and the powder, the gunpowder and all that. But of course, they were vastly outnumbered by the Indians. So at some point, that technology is only going to carry you so far. So it's really a number of factors. And indigenous people were not silent bystanders in their own conquest. They were at times cooperating and at times resisting, depending on their own tribe's interests and their own efforts at survival. And so it's really a much more complicated story. And the same thing in my book, and it's actually quite apparent even in Cabeza de Vaca's story, is that when they arrive, they are so certain that they are technologically advanced and these people are barely human, that it doesn't even occur to them that they're not going to succeed. And it's only through being forced to live in a completely unfamiliar environment of Florida, facing for the first time animals like alligators that they had never seen. You step in a swamp and suddenly an alligator pops up. That's not something that they expected. It's only through that experience of journeying inland and slowly realizing that they are ill-equipped to survive in a swampy weather, with cholera fast spreading among them, with tribes that sometimes resist them and sometimes help them. I really felt like that was something that had to be included in the book, the greater complexity of it, rather than just they come and they conquer.
Which you beautifully do. And so we call him Estebanico or Esteban, that's his name, but actually his mother gave him the name Mustafa, right?
Yes.
And he's
yes.
also, he's a Muslim by birth. He actually has to
Yes.
go to school and learn everything and does all the things that
Right.
daily matters that Muslim life is about. And so he's also in another time zone in a way, right? And which I also love, that it's sort of, you give sort of bits and pieces here and there where we actually notice that he himself lives in another time zone than his masters do, in a way. We're talking about early 16th century in European time, but for him, obviously, he lives in another time in a way. So how was that important for you to
Yeah.
focus on, or let us know at least?
My internet connection is unstable.
Oh yeah.
So in terms of so names play a hugely important role in the book, because names are part of our culture, part of how we identify, right? And one of the first acts that the Spaniards do when they land in La Florida is to call it La Florida and to start giving names to Spanish names to all of the villages in the land, and just basically give everything, naming something, way to claim power over it. And so man who is Moroccan is given a Spanish name and simply converted, which was something that all the slaves had to be converted, at least in on paper. And so in my book, it was very important that he identify himself by his quote unquote real name, which is Mustafa ibn Muhammad. So that's that in terms of the naming. And it's something that he back to over and over in the book, where he talks about how something is named or renamed. Right. In terms of like in a man, that took him to have these characteristics is, again, I wanted it to be as factually based as possible. Cabeza de Vaca tells us that he was an Arabic-speaking Black man from Moor. Moor is a majority Amazigh town. And so I reasoned, if this man is Amazigh, but he speaks Arabic, quite likely, and since he, I need him to be writing this document, he's Arabic speaking, most likely he picked up that through schooling. He had a certain number of schoolings, Quranic school for a few years. And so then that's when I decided to sort of give him that as part of his biography. It was something that I felt would be reasonable given the facts that we know about him. The other thing too is that this is taking place at a time when the Portuguese have just trading African continent. And the slave trade it hasn't yet become massive capitalistic enterprise that it would become in just a few decades. This is still the early stages of the slave trade. So this is a time when somebody could be enslaved and end up for a few years, in Spain, and possibly become free again. This isn't the slavery that happens in the United States beginning in 1619, which is a completely different system, and it's hereditary, and all of your descendants are slaves and all. It's just a slightly different, it's still the early days of the slave trade.
Right.
And so again, in deciding how to create and how to give him a sort of backstory, I went back and I looked at what else was happening in Moor. And there had been a massive drought that had affected that area, which is known as the breadbasket of Morocco. It's kind of like heavily agricultural.
Right.
And so because of that drought, a number of people had been left starving. There was a massive famine, and that's when a number of people slavery to pay debts or sold themselves, according to some historians. We have reports of as many as 60,000 Moroccan women transported to Portugal to become servants or concubines there. So it's just really the beginning of that era. And so given everything that's happening, I use these sort of like historical facts as inspiration for the biography that I give him in the book. It's entirely possible that his biography is slightly different. Right. But I felt that it was reasonable given what we know about him.
Sure. And also the context of where it comes from. Right. Okay. Well, before we go to the Q&A, some people have raised some questions already. And so I'm inviting all of you to give more questions. So we'll have some time for them to hand them to you later. But last question, because obviously, you could say history is very political right now. I mean, we can see that in Europe, but definitely also in the US. How, in the context of, and also you writing other books that also talk about migration, being the other, what citizenship is, that when are you a proper citizen or not, it ties into, in many ways, into the story of Esteban or Estebanico. Esteban. So how do these three books after each other now? So Moor's account and now these two, how do they mirror each other? What is the story, the bigger story in a way you want to tell us with these books?
Yeah, so the book we're talking about is the Moor's account, and I have another book that is coming out right now in the US that I'm doing promotion for, called Conditional Citizens, and that one is a book of nonfiction, as you mentioned. I think that my preoccupation is with identity and belonging, and those things are particularly tested when you cross a border. So the hero of the Moor's account is somebody who is born in Moor, is raised in Morocco, and through accidents of, the drought, climate change, all these things that are happening in the 16th century, political events that are outside of his control, as a result of those events, finds himself enslaved and swept into this incredible journey across the Atlantic as part of a Spanish expedition. Now, he has no quarrel with indigenous people, but he is part of this expedition to go and conquer La Florida. And that transforms who he is. In some sense, he becomes a modern American, someone who is from someplace but lands in America and fashions an entirely new identity. He becomes sort of a trusted translator. He learns some native languages and he's able to communicate with them. and also becomes a kind of a leader. He has a band of followers. So it is a story of transformation. He goes from being this enslaved man to being this leader of a band of followers that follow him from village to village. And to me, that is a quintessentially American story of transformation and renewal. In the nonfiction book that is coming out, I look at this from the perspective of fact and history, where I look at how citizenship is defined in the United States. And traditionally in the United States, citizenship and race are linked. So the very first piece of legislation that defined what counts as American in the United States, I mean, I don't know how it is in the Netherlands, but in the United States, 1790, they wrote a law that said that the people who qualify as citizens are free white persons. And so if you were free and white, you were an American citizen, and you could immigrate and become a US citizen, but otherwise you couldn't.
Right.
And the rights that flow from that status, like restricted to white male landowners. Hopefully my internet connection is stable. Okay, so you can see that like the way in which society defines who is American and who is a citizen already at the beginning is hierarchical, with rich white men at the top and everybody else at the bottom, with gradations in between. And it takes the United States 2 centuries to reform this system and to expand citizenship to people of other races. But that struggle has not ended. And that is where history plays a part, because history, in a sense, how we narrate the world around us and how we explain it to ourselves and to the people who are going to come after us. And because we are looking at it from the lens of the moment, history really is an argument. It's a never-ending argument about what really happened. So traditionally, you might, a century ago, you might teach the story of Christopher Columbus landing, the conquest of Mexico or the conquest of North America, as a story about brave white men who came and brought the light of civilization and Christianity here. But now that we go back and go over the same facts, that view has become challenged, and now we know that that is not exactly what happened. And these were expeditions that were driven not just by the desire to civilize, but by the desire to make money and to, conquer and take land. And that we also know that this involved people who are not white. We also know that it involved women. We know that sometimes the people who were conquered were coerced, or sometimes they cooperated. So it's a little bit more complicated than that. And I think that we are never going to stop reinterpreting history, because the more we analyze these facts, the better we understand them. I think that history is absolutely crucial. And if it were not, we would not have right now a president in the United States. He is right now in fights about what's called the 1619 Project, trying to prevent it from being taught in schools because he considers it un-American, and he wants instead to teach his own ways of being American. So you can see that history is always an argument, because it is about who we are as people, or as the country, or as a nation, or even as human beings.
So, okay, let's bring in some of the listeners, because sort of picking up on this one already. Someone asks, you use fact to fictionalize history. Which in your opinion is more important, fact or fiction, and why?
Fact, must I choose fact or fiction?
There you go.
I think that, I don't think that it's not as simple as an either or proposition. I don't think I think that facts are extremely important. And traditionally, we think of facts as events that happened that we can all agree on. Right? That's like, we all saw, you know, this earthquake happened or whatever, you know, like there's a fact and we all think we know those facts. But we are now moving in a time right now in 2020 where, because of the rise of social media and sort of news bubbles that people live in, where even the facts become under dispute, that can't even what's happening. Like, are the protests peaceful? Are they protests or are they riots? Right. So you can see that happening in the U.S. in real time. That even the facts are under dispute.
Right.
So I don't think that it's just a question of like fact or fiction. I think fiction enables us to see fact in context. Truth. The truth is slipperier than fact. You know, facts are hope, and fiction helps us make it a little, make it real. The truth.
Right. Yeah. And I'm sorry about the internet interruptions, but we keep going at it because, Laila, I hope you can still hear me.
I can hear you.
Great. So there's a couple of questions on how the book came about. So I'm gonna, one asks, how many times did you edit? And who assisted you? And someone else asked, how was the process of researching and writing in terms of dividing your time? So how much time on research, how much time on writing?
Yeah.
Did you use an outline based on the facts? Or
so I mentioned that it took 5 years to write. And I wish I could tell you that it was this very neat process of, I spent 2 years researching and then 2 years to write. Like that simple. It was a process where I was constantly researching as I went. Part of the reason for that is, in writing a book that is set between 1528 and 1536, often if I chose to create a scene that's taken in Texas in the spring of 1534, and I decide that my character is going to lean against a tree, okay, now I have to stop. What kind of a tree was native to Texas in 1534? So now I have to go and research that, right? Because I can't have them leaning against, I don't know, a eucalyptus and find out that eucalyptuses are not native to Texas. So oftentimes you don't really need, as a fiction writer, sometimes you don't know what kind of research you're going to need until you get to it. So I did a lot more research in the couple of years, that still was researching smaller things all the way to the end. In terms of the number of drafts, during the entire 5 years, it was 9 drafts. I did have an outline, but not an outline of scenes. It was an outline of like what happened each year. So, for example, April 1527 is when Spain, when they land in Cuba, this is when they land in Florida, this is when they are found, this is roughly. So it was mostly an itinerary more than an outline, just so that I would know where I'm going. And in terms of the editing, I wrote the entire book, and then it was submitted to, I did multiple drafts, and then my agent sent it to publishers. They turned it down. And one of them said, oh no, this is too masculine. And I'm like, it's written from the point of a man. It's supposed to be masculine. And so anyway, so then I went away for another year more, and then I sent it out. And then it sold to my editor. And he gave me some feedback, and I went and I did some edits. And then when I brought them back, it was like, okay, here's your release date. It was a very simple process. There was not a lot of back and forth about the text. Wow. There was not a lot. No, it was basically, it was what you read is what I wrote. The only difference is he had some suggestions that were more like about the architecture rather than suggestions about lines or any of it. So what you read is basically what I came up with.
Well done. Okay. let's go to the last question, and I'm going to try and tie in actually a sort of more of a remark with also a question, because somebody's saying that your point on identity and belonging is so well articulated, this notion of how race and citizenship are very much intertwined. And in the European, or at least Dutch, Belgian situation, we're people who migrate from other parts are called, have this categorizing, which is allochtoon, which means you're from somewhere else, and then there's the
Yes.
and the Western part of that.
Yes.
And so the ultimate non-Western allochtonous person, you could say, is the Moroccan person, especially in the also being criminalized and whatnot. So there's that. But then there's also the question of someone who says, well, for those who do not know that much about Moroccan culture, what do you hope they learn about it? And then maybe tie that in a little bit to this notion of the Moroccan being seen as the ultimate other. So what do you hope that people pick up?
I think what I would ask people is to consider why they need an other in order to define themselves. Like, as a country, why does the Netherlands need an other in order to define itself? What benefits it from this notion? Why do we have it? Who is really raising these questions about identity? Is it Moroccan themselves? Is it Moroccans themselves, or is it somebody else? Like, really, where does the root of the question lie? I would also encourage people to more about Moroccan history, not just through the story of this incredible swashbuckling my book, but also just about the history of Morocco, which is a very complicated country. It is multi-ethnic, it is multilingual, it is multiracial. It is an incredibly beautiful country with a very long history. And to think that you know about it based on something that you see in the newspaper is a little bit restrictive. I think we want to turn to look at history and what history has to tell us. Here in the United States, we have similar notions about Muslims being outsiders, when in fact, as you see from my story, Muslims were here before there was the United States, before 1619, before all of that. In fact, I have a whole piece in the New York Times about this last weekend. So I think really I would encourage the questioner to examine the question itself and why it is being posed. What does it mean to define Dutchness in terms of where does that idea lie, and what does that tell us about the Netherlands itself? So shift the question that way and see whether you might not come up with a better answer.
It's a great answer to a difficult question. Thank you so much, Laila Lalami, to be with us in this weird moment in time. Keep writing, because we love your writing. And people, this is the book. You can buy it in your local bookstore. It's from Uitgeverij, so publisher Nieuw Amsterdam. It was translated by Lucy van Rooyen and Inger Limburg. Get your copy. It's a great read. Thank you so much, Laila. I enjoyed it thoroughly, and I hope to speak more with you in another occasion. Take care.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for being here. Bye.
Bye, everyone. This was Border Kitchen. Thanks for having us.